Sanctuary in the snow. I admit that when Poirot first suggested our winter trip to Switzerland, I had imagined nothing more strenuous than afternoon strolls through St. Maritz's fashionable promenades, punctuated by the occasional game of bridge. In a cozy hotel lounge, the promise of fresh mountain air and delicious Swiss cuisine piqued my interest, especially after the gloomy London winter we had just had. How different our actual destination turned out to be from our comfortable expectations. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in late January, right as we were finishing our travel plans. Poirot regarded the yellow paper with the strange intensity he reserved for true attention, his gray eyes gliding mechanically across the text. Tas. He whispered, placing down his morning coffee with a subtle clink on the china saucer. "Mon ami, it appears that our vacation plans will need to change slightly. Nothing major." I hoped, though something about his demeanor suggested otherwise. "A consultation is requested, a delicate matter, as these things so often are." He handed me the message with his mustache quivering slightly. "Do you understand from an old acquaintance? Dr. Hercule Poirot, Clinic Lac Noir." I had to read the brief message twice before I understood what it meant. Dr. Harry requested Poirot's knowledge in a case of extreme confidentiality and urgency. The facility appeared to be located some 40 kilometers from our chosen location, up in the Alpine hills above Lake Geneva. I said, Dr. Harry, do you know him well? We met a few years ago in Brussels, before the conflict. A smart individual dedicated to the treatment of nerve illnesses. He has gained a strong reputation in recent years for his work with shell-shocked veterans. Poirot's fingers drummed intently on the table. It's interesting that he should need the services of you, Poirot. Dr. Harry is not prone to irrational thinking. And so 3 days later, we found ourselves ascending the dangerous mountain roads in a rented car, our driver handling the serpentine twists with amazing competence despite the increasingly threatening weather. The journey from the railway station had taken about 2 hours. Each mile takes us upward into a region of breathtaking, almost savage beauty. Mondor. But it's magnificent, Poirot cried, his breath misting the window as he looked out at the towering peaks that surrounding us. However, I observed he clutched the door handle firmly as we approached another hairpin turn, the road descending sharply to our left. The Clinique Lac Noir impressed me from the start. The building rose from the mountainside like a modernist's dream, with clean lines and expansive windows made of pale stone and steel that blended seamlessly with the rocky outcropping on which it stood. The frozen stretch of water that gave the facility its name could be found 100 meters below. Down a steep snow-covered slope, the lake was certainly dark as midnight, its surface a mirror of ice reflecting the descending clouds above. Most spectacular. I observed as our car pulled to a halt in the circular drive. What about a castle in the air? Poirot nodded, but I could see his detective mind was already at work, cataloging details with the painstaking precision that had solved so many seemingly impossible crimes. Observe Hastings' geometric perfection. Every angle is properly calculated, and every line serves both form and purpose. It speaks of a mind that prioritizes order over all else. The entry hall was as impressive as the outside. The interior design carried on the austere modernist motif, with polished marble floors, stark white walls ornamented with carefully selected pieces of contemporary art, and a sense of clinical precision that seemed to define the establishment. The air appeared to buzz with the quiet efficiency of a treatment center. Dr. Hercule Poirot appeared within moments of our arrival, no doubt prompted by the distinctive sound of our motor's engine. He was about 55 years old, tall and spare, with an aristocratic demeanor reminiscent of old European culture. His prematurely white hair was swept back from a high brow, and his dark eyes had an intensity that was immediately noticeable. Poirot, he cried, advancing with outstretched hands. How good of you to come at such short notice, and Captain Hastings, your reputation precedes you, sir. The warmth of his greeting could not totally conceal an underlying tension that appeared to emanate from the manly heat of a fever. I saw that his hands were calm and precise, as one would expect from a medical practitioner. However, there was something in his demeanor, a fast-darting glance toward the windows, and a tendency to lower his voice even in normal conversation, that suggested a mind under significant strain. "You will find your accommodations quite comfortable," Dr. Harry said, taking us to what appeared to be a reception area. "The clinic operates under the idea of full rest and isolation. There are no newspapers, phone calls, or outside interruptions. My patients find that such an environment is most beneficial to their recuperation." As if summoned by his words, a woman in pristine nurse's clothing came at his elbow, probably 40 years old, with dark hair tightly tucked beneath her cap and a quietly efficient demeanor that spoke of years spent serving others. She moved with the practiced precision of someone used to anticipate her employer's wants. "Elena will show you to your rooms," Dr. Harry explained. "We dine at 7, which is early by London standards, but the mountain air has a wonderful effect on the appetite." As we followed the nurse toward the guest quarters, I became aware of the approaching storm. The wind had begun to pick up, whistling around the building's corners with increasing strength, and through the large windows, I could see fresh snow falling in thick, heavy flakes that foreshadowed severe weather. Poirot, too, had witnessed the deteriorating situation. He paused at one of the corridor windows, his reflection ghost-like in the dimly lit glass. "Vimo," he said quietly, so only I could hear. "It looks that we have arrived at a highly appropriate moment." Or perhaps he left the thought incomplete, but something about his tone sent shivers down my spine. A distant thunderclap echoed over the heights, barely audible above the rising wind. But I knew thunder was unlikely at this time in elevation. The rumble intensified for a time before fading, leaving just the whistle of the wind and the quiet patter of snow against the windows. The mountains seemed to be closing in around us. Chapter 2, Death and Crystal Waters. I was startled awake not by the gentle chime of the bedside clock, but by a strange sense of silence that seemed to press against the windows of our guest room. The storm that had been gathering intensity throughout the previous evening had died down during the night, leaving an eerie quiet that was almost tangible. Poirot was already dressed and stood by the window in his customary focused concentration position. His small, clean figure was silhouetted against the pale morning light, and I could see his breath producing small clouds in the cold air of the room. "Bon matin, Hastings," he replied without turning. "Come and observe, if you please, the handiwork of Mother Nature." I joined him at the window and instantly recognized the source of his attention. During the night, a massive avalanche came down from the peaks above, effectively cutting off the clinic's only mountain path to the outside world. Where there had formerly been a short but practicable path running down through the pine forests, there's now a wide field of snow and debris, with the occasional black stem of an uprooted pine jutting like the mast of a sunken ship. "Good Lord," I exclaimed, "we are absolutely shut off, aren't we?" Poirot responded precisely, his gray eyes analyzing the scene with the methodical attention I was used with. Most convenient for someone who wants to ensure that specific occurrences are not disrupted by outside intervention. Before I could inquire what he meant by this rather cryptic statement, a piercing cry resonated through the corridors of the facility, a sound that pierced the morning calm like a razor. It was immediately followed by a quick patter of feet and an agitated murmur of voices. We quickly dressed and made our way to the source of the ruckus. The hydrotherapy wing of the clinic was on the ground floor, accessible by a number of connected hallways that continued the building's geometric precision concept. As we neared, we saw Elena, the nurse we had seen the previous evening, racing in the opposite direction. Her normally controlled face turned pale with shock as she gripped a set of keys in her quivering palm. "There was an accident," she continued, hastily, her faint accent becoming more noticeable in her distress. Dr. Coy is in the pool. I must call for aid. But she motioned helplessly toward the windows, beyond which the avalanche had rendered communication impossible. The hydrotherapy pool was enclosed in a cathedral-like structure made of glass and steel. The chambers rose to a height of about 30 feet, with walls made nearly completely of windows that afforded a breathtaking view of the frozen lake below and the snow-capped peaks beyond. Under normal conditions, I believe the effect would have been both inspirational and therapeutic. This morning, however, the chamber had been turned into something even more terrifying. The pool itself was a masterpiece of modern engineering. Rectangular in shape, about 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, with what appeared to be a complex system of pipes and machinery visible beneath the ornate stonework that surrounds it. The most astounding feature, however, was the thin coating of ice that had developed across its surface overnight, forming what appeared to be a crystal window into the depths beneath. And through this natural glass, we could see Dr. Emile Coe laying face down in the midst of the pool, his white hair streaming like kelp in the softly circulating water. "Montour," Poirot murmured, his keen gaze soaking in every element of the scene. "Most extraordinary." The local constable, a rugged mountain guy called Klaus Weber, who had been trapped at the clinic by the same avalanche that had imprisoned the rest of us, stood hopelessly at the pool's edge. His aged face revealed the expression of a man burdened with issues well beyond his customary scope of petty local transgressions. "I cannot break the ice without disturbing everything," he stated in badly accented English as we approached. "And the machines, I don't understand how it works." Poirot nodded seriously and began a careful inspection of the pool's surrounds. I observed as he studied the complicated set of controls that managed the water temperature, circulation, and chemical treatment. His attention was drawn to what appeared to be a protective grate that covered the pool, most likely a safety mechanism designed to avoid incidents of this sort. "Most curious," he mumbled, crouching beside the device that regulated the enormous. "Consider this grating, Hastings. It has been meticulously refinished." I bent down to examine the contraption more closely. The grate was composed of stainless steel with a small mesh that could sustain a person's weight while enabling water to flow freely. It was fastened with a number of bolts that exhibited apparent signs of recent manipulation. It appears that this safety barrier was removed and subsequently reinstated, but Dr. Harry would not have entered the pool with the grate in place. This would make escape impossible. "Exactmo," Poirot remarked gently. "Isn't it most illuminating?" Dr. Heinrich Zimmer, whom we had met briefly the previous evening, emerged with keys to access the pool's management systems. He was a young man of around 35, with the earnest demeanor of someone dedicated to his job, though I noted his hands shook slightly as he controlled the knobs. He said that the heating system had been operating all night as the ice began to break and dissolve due to the warming water. The pool maintains a constant temperature of 28 C for therapeutic purposes. The ice development is merely superficial, a result of the intense cold that penetrated even our heating systems. As the ice melted, the awful reality of Dr. C's fate became painfully evident. The distinguished physician remained motionless in the center of the pool, his evening gown sodden and his face bearing an expression of almost peaceful repose that seemed strangely at odds with the circumstances of his passing. "We must recover the body," Constable Weber remarked, while his reluctance to disturb what was plainly a murder scene was evident in his approach. Poirot interjected sharply. "First, we observe, record, and grasp what the scene is trying to teach us. For the following quarter hour, my pal gave a masterclass in criminal investigation. He inspected every part of the pool area with the same rigorous attention to detail that had resolved so many seemingly difficult cases. He observed Dr. C's body position, the state of his clothing, the precise mechanism used to latch the safety grate, and the many control systems that govern the pool's operation. Meanwhile, word of the catastrophe had traveled throughout the clinic, and we soon found ourselves encircled by the other inmates of this distant refuge. Major Reginald Thornfield appeared, his military posture clear despite the shaking in his palms, which indicated his disturbed state. The Countess Vladislava Korsikov arrived with Elena, her aristocratic features poised but alert. Dr. Margaret Vance, the visiting neurologist, viewed the proceedings with the clinical objectivity of someone used to dealing with life-or-death situations. Each face showed a unique expression of shock and dismay. However, I couldn't shake the notion that somewhere within this tiny group of seemingly decent people lurked a mind capable of changing a healing environment into a murder scene. The retrieval of Dr. C's body corroborated what the visual evidence had previously shown. There were no evident signs of violence and no wounds or injuries to explain his being in the pool. However, the careful refastening of the safety grate above him indicated human activity rather than accidental death. As Constable Weber oversaw the somber work of taking the body from the sea, Poirot drew me aside with a grim satisfaction. "Raymond Hastings has supplied us with a truly intriguing puzzle," he mumbled. "A clever locked room mystery set under conditions that require urgent and complex inquiry." The full repercussions of our situation were becoming more apparent. Cut isolated from the outer world by the avalanche with no option of communication or assistance, we were stuck in this lonely mountain eyrie with a murderer who had previously shown cunning and determination. The pure mountain retreat had become a jail, and somewhere among its immaculate hallways strode a killer who was certain their crime would never be uncovered. Chapter 3: Fractured Minds and Hidden Motives. The morning after Dr. Harry's death was discovered was clear and crisp, with the mountain peaks gleaming like crystal in the thin alpine air. However, within the walls of the Clinique Lac Noir, an uneasy atmosphere had fallen like a constant fog. The therapeutic establishment's typical rhythms had been disrupted, and I noticed that the staff carried out their responsibilities with the nervous efficiency of people who were aware that they were being watched. Poirot had placed himself in Dr. Harry's private study, which exhibited the late occupant's love of order and precision. Medical journals were organized on the shelves with mathematical precision, and the desk was devoid of clutter except for a single fountain pen positioned perfectly at a right angle to a leather-bound appointment book. "We'll do our interviews here," Poirot said, settling up behind the mahogany desk. "With the air of a man ready for a long campaign. It is critical that you understand that we speak with each individual in circumstances that may encourage candeur. Our first guest was Major Reginald Thornfield, and I must admit that my first impression was one of deep pity. The man who entered possessed all of the characteristics of distinguished military service. Despite obvious physical distress, his posture remained straight, and his gray eyes maintained the steady gaze of one accustomed to command. However, there was something delicate about him, as if he were made of glass and held together by pure willpower. "Terrible business," the Major started, gingerly lowering himself into the chair Poirot had indicated. I saw that his hands trembled slightly as he grasped the armrests, and he had a nervous habit of looking out the windows, as if expecting some invisible menace to emerge from the white terrain beyond. "Indeed, mon ami," Poirot said kindly. "You were, I understand, a patient of Dr. Harry." "Patient?" The term erupted with surprising fervor. The man handled us like laboratory specimens. "There is no understanding of what we have lived through or experienced." His voice lowered to a mumble. He termed it shell shock. "Malingering, more recently." Poirot's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. "Dr. Harry questioned the legitimacy of your ailment. If you must know, they threatened to dismiss me, claiming that I was reflecting too much on previous traumas and that it was time to join the living." Major Thornfield laughed without humor. "It's easy to say when you've never heard dying men's screams or witnessed what powerful explosives do to the body. I found myself examining the Major's expression as he spoke, observing how his jaw tensed and his pupils dilated slightly when he mentioned his military experiences. The man was definitely in pain, yet there was something in his demeanor that implied depths I couldn't quite comprehend. "Your nights here at the clinic," Poirot explained in his most conversational tone. "They are troubled, perhaps." "Dreams," the Major said reluctantly. "I sometimes lose track of time. Dr. Zimmer assures me that it is not uncommon in cases like mine, but it is quite disturbing to wake up in areas you don't remember going." The interview ended with Poirot's customary courtesy. However, I could see that he had saved every gesture, hesitation, and telling statement for later consideration. That our following interview was also instructive in its own way. Vladislava Kursov, the author of the Diateles, entered the room with the demeanor of someone used to being treated with respect. However, I noticed an underlying uneasiness that her aristocratic demeanor could not completely cover. She was a woman around 60 years old, with silver hair styled in an ornate coiffure and dark eyes that seemed to overlook nothing. "This is quite unusual," she stated, settling herself with the air of one who granted an audience. "In my day, such situations were handled with far more delicacy." Madame Lontes and Poirot began with a courtly bow. "I am really appreciative for your cooperation in these challenging circumstances. Dr. Harry was my doctor," she explained, as if Poirot had not spoken. "A clever man, if perhaps overly forward in some of his tactics. While one values innovation, there are limitations to what civilized people should tolerate." Elena remained near the door during the interview, her cautious gaze never leaving her boss. The nurse's protective demeanor was clear in every line of her stance, and I saw how she appeared to anticipate the Countess' demands before they were articulated. "You found Dr. Harry's treatment satisfactory?" Poirot inquired. The Countess's equanimity faltered for a brief moment. "Satisfactory is possibly a too strong word. One endures what is necessary in the pursuit of health." It was during our third interview that the entire intricacy of the matter began to emerge. Dr. Margaret Vance entered the study with the brisk efficiency of a lady accustomed to professional obstacles. However, beneath her controlled facade, I detected a current of barely contained rage. "I assume you'll want to know about my relationship with Emo," she answered without hesitation, grabbing the offered chair with a firm grip. "We didn't hide our disagreements on methods." Dr. Vance was a woman of 45 years old, with iron gray hair pulled back and sharp eyes that seemed to analyze and calculate all they saw. Her clothes were utilitarian rather than stylish, and her hands had the calluses of someone who had done both manual and cerebral work. "You disagree, right?" Poirot prompted softly. "He took my research," she said with a flatness that somehow made the accusation more compelling than any impassioned outpouring could have been. 3 years of research on brain pathway reconstruction was published under his name in the Berlin Medical Journal. When I disagreed, he indicated that a woman with my little experience may have misread the collaborative nature of scientific work. The controlled rage in her voice was obvious, and I found myself wondering what depths of bitterness such professional betrayal would have engendered. "Yet you accepted his invitation to visit the clinic," Poirot said. "I came to reclaim what was mine," Dr. Vance explained plainly. "Emile planned to sell his research portfolio to a German pharmaceutical company. I planned to submit evidence of his plagiarism before the transaction could be consummated." Poirot conducted similar interviews with Dr. Zimmer and the various staff members throughout the day, each one revealing additional layers of intricacy in the web of relationships that connects the residents of this isolated sanctuary. I was intrigued by his systematic approach, the way he appeared to collect information on everything from food plans to sleeping arrangements, therapy regimens to personal habits. I mentioned, Poirot, during a brief intermission between interviewees, that some of your inquiries seem quite unrelated to the subject at hand. What difference does it make who takes their morning constitutional when, or which patients suffer from insomnia? My friend's gray eyes twinkled with that familiar look of patient enjoyment. Ah, Mosher Hastings, but it is precisely these nuances that serve as the foundation for the construction of reality. A murder, you see, is never just one instance of violence. It represents the culmination of a complex web of relationships, motivations, and opportunities. To understand the crime, one must first comprehend the context in which it occurred. As evening neared and the staff began to prepare for dinner, I reflected on the day's events. We interviewed individuals who had both the motive and opportunity to commit murder. However, none appeared to be capable of the cold calculations required to carry out such a complex crime. The Major's apparent instability, the Countess's obvious concern, and Dr. Vance's professional hostility were all powerful reasons to wish Dr. Hurrier harm. However, something about their demeanor hinted that we hadn't yet seen the true center of this mountain enigma. The dining room that evening was a study in suppressed anxiety, with everyone maintaining a courteous demeanor despite the fact that they were eating with a killer. As I saw the careful politeness, stilted conversation, and darting looks between our fellow guests, I couldn't help but feel as if we were performers in some elaborate theatrical show, each performing a character while disguising their true identity. Game had begun, but I knew that the most deadly moves were yet to be made. Chapter 4. Secrets beneath the surface. The second day of our enforced solitude dawned gloomy and forbidding, with fresh snow beginning to fall in a manner that suggested the weather had not yet finished with us. Poirot was in the hydrotherapy wing at 6 a.m., inspecting the pool's sophisticated equipment with the concentration of a master clockmaker analyzing a particularly detailed timepiece. Regarding Hastings, he replied without looking up from the control panel he was scrutinizing. This system, manufactured in Germany, is the most complex. To use it properly, you must have detailed knowledge of its mechanisms rather than just a passing familiarity with them. Looked over his shoulder at the incomprehensible collection of knobs, gauges, and switches controlling the pool's temperature, circulation, and chemical balance. The complexity was truly astonishing, well beyond what I would have expected from even the most advanced therapy establishment. Are you talking about someone who has had hydrotherapy training? I proposed Prissimate, or someone who has spent significant time observing its operation. His dark gaze went steadily across the controls. Please note the sequence required to activate the safety device. Most complex, and certainly not something one could accomplish by luck or desperation. Elena entered in the doorway at that exact time, carrying a tray full of fresh towels. I noticed her almost imperceptible pause when she recognized our presence, and there was something in her expression, a flicker of what may have been apprehension, that piqued my interest. "Excuse me," she said in a gently accented voice. "I didn't realize the pool area was occupied." "Menemenisal," Poirot replied politely. "Please do not allow us to disrupt your job. Indeed, perhaps you could assist us. You're familiar with this gadget, n'est-ce pas?" Elena walked ahead with the characteristic quickness I'd mentioned earlier, setting down her tray with practiced precision. As she began to explain the various controls, I found myself looking at her more carefully. She was a woman around 35 years old with dark hair that she kept in a basic but lovely way beneath her nurse's cap. Her motions were economical and graceful, demonstrating expert training. Yet there was something else, a nervous habit of smoothing her starched uniform whenever the discourse veered to technical issues. Dr. Harry insisted on all nursing personnel understanding the whole operation of the therapeutic equipment. She added, her hands confidently sliding over the buttons. He believed that thorough information was critical to patient safety. Poirot mumbled, "Most commendable. Mademoiselle, you've been working here for a long time." Elena responded after nearly 2 years. However, I observed a tiny hesitancy before answering. "I accompanied the Countess when she first sought therapy for her ailment. Her tone implied depths undiscovered, and I made a mental note to address this insight with Poirot as soon as possible. Dr. Heinrich Zimmer arrived, interrupting our discourse with the frantic expression of a man attempting to preserve order under circumstances way above his experience. He was younger than I had expected, possibly no older than 35, with the pale complexion and slightly bent shoulders of someone who spent the majority of his time indoors studying medical literature. "Mr. Poirot," he said in extremely accented English, "I've been reading Dr. Harry's latest patient files as you requested. I must admit that certain of his tactics in recent months have been particularly troubling." Elena's hands remained motionless on the towels she was arranging, and I observed a piercing gaze between her and Dr. Zimmer, one that spoke of common understanding and concern. Poirot inquired softly. Dr. Zimmer exchanged uneasy glances with Elena before appearing to make an internal choice. "His therapies have gotten increasingly severe, particularly with patients demonstrating resistance to conventional therapy. Major Thornfield, for example, was subjected to experimental treatments that I questioned in private." This revelation prompted an immediate private meeting with Poirot in Dr. Harry's study, where Dr. Zimmer's account was both informative and disturbing. The new physician described his mentor's progressive metamorphosis from respected practitioner to something resembling a medical tyrant, inflicting increasingly drastic treatments on patients who expressed inadequate thanks for his efforts. Dr. Zimmer described Major Thornfield's reliance on a novel form of sedative therapy. With his hands gripped securely in his lap, Dr. Harrier threatened to terminate the treatment totally unless the Major demonstrated greater collaboration with the therapeutic process. And the nature of this cooperation, Poirot instilled utter surrender to Dr. Harry's authority and absolute trust in his methods, regardless of the patient's comfort or wants. Dr. Zimmer's voice had lowered to barely above a whisper. "It wasn't healing, Mr. Poirot. It was domination." The afternoon brought an unexpected revelation, which shed new light on some of our suspects. While visiting the clinic's library, a magnificent space filled with medical manuscripts and philosophical works, I stumbled upon the Countess conversing with Elena. They stood at one of the tall windows facing the icy lake, their voices low but their postures stiff from apparent worry. Elena spoke gently but firmly. "The past cannot be changed, madame. What occurred in St. Petersburg was not your responsibility." "Easy words," the Countess said coldly. But Dr. Harrier did not see things that way. He made it abundantly clear that my misdeeds would become public knowledge unless I continued to submit to his therapies and pay his expensive costs. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Blackmail was a motive as old as crime itself, and it put the Countess' anxious conduct in a whole new light. My unintended eavesdropping was halted by the appearance of Dr. Margaret Vance, who entered the library with the purposeful stride of someone looking for precise knowledge. Her face exhibited the expression of barely controlled rage that has become her trademark since our arrival. "I've been reviewing the publication records," she said without preamble, addressing Elena rather than me. "It is worse than ordinary thievery. Emile purposefully undermined my research applications, harmed my professional relationships, and steadily ruined my reputation in the European medical community." Elena's composure wavered for a brief while, and I noticed another of those telltale gestures as she brushed her uniform with quivering fingers. "Surely there must have been some recourse," Elena quietly remarked. "What redress exists against a man of Emile's reputation and connections?" Dr. Vance's laugh was unfunny. He was incredibly bright and thorough. The damage was already done when I realized what he had done. As nighttime arrived, I found myself alone in Dr. Harry's study, endeavoring to organize Poirot's different notes and observations from our studies. The late physician's desk had been mostly untouched since our arrival, and I admit that my natural curiosity drove me to inspect its contents more closely than was strictly appropriate. It was in the locked bottom drawer, opened with a letter opener and great patience, that I uncovered a revelation that froze me to the bone. Hidden beneath a stack of medical journals was a bundle of documents that revealed the full extent of Dr. C's deteriorating condition. Personal letters written in increasingly erratic style described delusional thoughts and extravagant ideas. Patient files included inappropriate personal observations and unsettling commentary about their psychological situations. Most damningly, a private diary revealed a mind filled with distrust, certain that his patients, staff, and colleagues were plotting against him. The final entry, dated only 3 days before his death, was extremely disturbing. They are constantly watching me, looking for signs of weakness, but I am stronger than they realize and smarter than they think. Despite their protestations and threats, the treatments will continue as I see fit. I am the master here, and they must learn to respect my authority or suffer the consequences. As I sat in the increasing darkness of the alpine evening, surrounded by the evidence of a great mind's tragic demise, I realized that what we were dealing with was considerably more complicated than simple murder. Dr. Emile Coe had established his own secret kingdom in this mountain fortress, governing over his patients and staff with the arbitrary authority of a desperate man. In doing so, he sowed the seeds of his own demise, resulting in a circle of victims, each with compelling reasons to wish him dead. The question remained, which of them has both the expertise and the determination to turn that wish into a devastating reality? As the wind whistled around the clinic's modern walls and snow continued to fall beyond the windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were only scratching the surface of this mountain mystery, and that the most dangerous secrets were hidden beneath the veneer of civilized respectability that each of our suspects worked so hard to maintain. Chapter 5. Thin Ice. Thinner alibis. The third morning of our imprisonment brought an air of barely repressed anxiousness that appeared to pervade every area of the clinic. During breakfast, I saw that our fellow guests were looking at each other with the tired distrust of individuals who knew there was a killer among them. Conversations were awkward and brief, interspersed by extended pauses in which one could practically hear the mental machinery of accusation and counter-accusation grinding away beneath perfectly produced expressions. Poirot had summoned each of our suspects for what he called a more detailed discussion of the evening's events, and I could see from his painstaking preparation that he meant to scrutinize their accounts to the fullest extent possible. He had set up Dr. C's study with customary accuracy, displaying a complete floor map of the clinic on the desk with a timeline he had created from the many narratives already provided. "Well, Hastings," he remarked, pointing to the paperwork with apparent satisfaction, "now we'll see how well these stories hold up in the harsh light of logic and consistency." Major Thornfield was our first visitor, and I was immediately struck by the difference in his mood since our original conversation. The military baron remained, but his eyes were haunted, speaking of sleepless nights and troubling thoughts. He accepted the provided chair with the cautious motions of a man aware of his own vulnerability. Major Poirot started gently. "I'd like you to relate your movements on the evening of Dr. C's death." "I retired early," Thornfield said, his voice firm despite the tremble in his palms. "Maybe 9 o'clock. Dr. Zimmer can confirm this. He helped me with my nighttime medications." The failings. Major's composure shattered somewhat. "I had horrific dreams as usual. The war, you understand, with its screams and bombs." His voice had lowered to just above a whisper. "However, this time, the dreams were different. I fantasized of drowning him and held him beneath the water until life fled his eyes." Poirot's visage remained deadpan despite my chilling reaction to his confession. My companion said, "These dreams seemed particularly vivid, more real than reality," which Thornfield admitted. "When I awoke, my nightclothes were damp from perspiration, and I could taste chlorine in my tongue. But I have no recall of leaving my room, or of anything other than the nightmare, When asked to validate this allegation, Dr. Zimmer supplied troubling proof of the Major's nightly wanderings. "Yeah, it's most common with his condition," the young doctor said uneasily. "Several times I have found him in different parts of the clinic during the night. The trauma, it creates a dissociation between sleeping and waking states." On the night in question, Poirot persisted. Dr. Zimmer grudgingly stated, "I heard him moving around midnight. When I checked his room at 2 o'clock, he was sleeping soundly, although his bed appeared to have been disturbed." Our conversation with the Countess was equally revealing, albeit in ways that called into question her carefully manufactured mask of aristocratic decorum. Elena followed her mistress as usual, but I saw that the nurse's protective demeanor had increased, as if she was afraid of what would be revealed. "I spent the evening in prayer," the Countess stated with the conviction of someone used to having her word accepted without inquiry. "My private chapel, a small room I have arranged for my devotions." Poirot studied his notes with painstaking deliberation. "Your devotions continued all night, madame, until nearly dawn," she replied, though I detected a slight hesitation in her tone. Elena's composure eventually broke. "Forgive me, madame," she replied calmly, her gaze fixed firmly on her folded hands. "But I must be truthful. You had one of your episodes at night. I spotted you wandering the corridors around 1 o'clock, distressed and disoriented." The Countess's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Elena, you have forgotten yourself," the nurse said gently and firmly. "I cannot remain silent when lives may depend on the truth. You have no recollection of these wanderings, madam. They occur during moments of high tension, and you are not entirely conscious of it." When Dr. Margaret Vance's alibi was thoroughly investigated, it proved to be similarly problematic. She insisted that she had spent the evening working in her makeshift laboratory, a small room in the clinic's basement that Dr. Herrera had reluctantly allowed her to use for research. "I was checking my notes till maybe 2 a.m., she said confidently, as if she were used to precise schedules. "My profession takes absolute concentration, particularly when dealing with intricate cerebral pathway calculations." Poirot, the most dedicated, made a small observation. "And you had enough light for such detailed work." "Certainly, the room is outfitted with excellent electrical fixtures." Constable Weber unwittingly destroyed this alibi. When asked about security precautions, he mentioned that he conducts regular patrols around the clinic fence. "I check all the windows each night," he added in his cautious English. After 11 p.m. on Tuesday, the basement laboratory went dark. There is no light anyplace in that area of the building. Dr. Vance's reaction to this inconsistency was a burst of wrath that she battled to contain. "Perhaps your observation was mistaken," she said coldly. "The windows are small, and the lighting may not have been visible from outside." As the day continued, Poirot's inquiry revealed more unsettling details concerning Dr. Harry's recent activities and mental state. A search of his private office revealed a stockpile of documents that depicted a guy whose bright intellect had become increasingly perverted by paranoia and megalomania. Among the most surprising finds was an apparently never-sent letter sent to a pharmaceutical company in Berlin. In it, Dr. Harry stated his plan to permanently close the clinic and sell his entire research portfolio, which included what he claimed as breakthrough treatments for the complete psychological reformation of traumatized people. More troubling was a collection of patient files containing highly improper observations. Dr. Harry had documented not only medical symptoms and therapy responses, but also intimate personal data, private chats, and psychological weaknesses unrelated to valid therapeutic objectives. Munduro mumbled as we examined these materials in the solitude of his chamber. The man became fascinated with power. Not the ability to heal, but to dominate and manipulate people in his care. The most incriminating discovery was a precise plan for the final phase of treatment, as described by Dr. Herrera. A series of experimental techniques designed, in his words, to eradicate all resistance to therapeutic authority by systematically breaking down individual will. As dusk approached, the mood inside the facility became almost unbearable. The discovery that their trusted physician had been filming their most private moments and planned to expose them to progressively intrusive treatments had broken the group's faith. Accusations flew with increasing frequency, and I noticed that everyone was sure that one of their companions was guilty of murder. During this period of increasing strain, Constable Weber made a finding that looked to reveal the physical evidence that had hitherto escaped us. During a meticulous investigation of the clinic's common spaces, he discovered a little brass key wedged behind one of the radiators in the main corridor, which Dr. Zimmer immediately recognized as belonging to the hydrotherapy pool's control panel. Dr. Zimmer explained to us as we gathered around the evidence that this key is essential to access the safety systems. Without it, the great mechanism cannot function. The key had unmistakable fingerprints and, more importantly, remnants of what seemed to be the same specialist lubricant used in the pool's machinery. Finally, there was physical proof of the killer's identity. Or so it seemed until Pooh subjected the evidence to his typical examination. As I watched my friend carefully inspect the key with his magnifying glass, noting every scratch and marking, I couldn't shake the sensation that we were approaching a critical point in our research. The alibis had shattered, the secrets had been revealed, and now tangible evidence had surfaced that clearly pointed to our murderer. However, something about Poirot's demeanor suggested that he viewed this expedient discovery with serious mistrust. As if the evidence's obviousness was enough to cast doubt, the game of cat and mouse that had been taking place in the clinic's exquisite halls was nearing its conclusion. But I knew that the most shocking disclosures were still to come. Chapter 6. A Soldier's Confession. The fourth day of our confinement began with an oppressive quiet that appeared to push against the clinic's walls. The discovery of the brass key had exerted a pull on our small society, and I noticed that the ordinary courtesies of civilized interaction were fraying under the strain. Conversations were spoken in whispers, and apprehensive glances were cast at each other's movements with the intensity of individuals who understood that final discoveries could no longer be withheld. Dr. Zimmer expressed concern at Major Thornfield's absence during breakfast. "He has been in his room since yesterday evening," the young physician told Pooh during our morning conference, "most upset, refusing all medication and discussing issues that make me very concerned." "What manner of matters?" Poirot queried with the false mildness that frequently accompanied his most insightful remarks. "He continuously discusses the battle, drowning men, and his responsibility for tragedies that occurred years ago." Dr. Zimmer's hands trembled slightly as he reviewed his notes. "But more disturbingly, he has begun to conflate the past and the present, talking to Dr. Harry as if he were a German officer who must be stopped at all costs. It was probably around 10 p.m. when the crisis reached its logical conclusion. Was in the library, hoping to divert myself with a volume of alpine geology, when the sound of heated voices echoed down the corridor. Following the disturbance, I noticed a crowd formed outside Major Thornfield's room, where Constable Weber was attempting to calm an increasingly tense situation. The Major stood at his doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour, his military uniform hard, with the desperate resolve I'd seen in men pushed to their emotional limits. His gray eyes had a haunting aspect that told of restless nights and tormented thoughts, and I observed that his hands trembled with a pulse unrelated to his physical. "Condit, I must speak with Mr. Poirot," he announced, his voice commanding despite its underlying tremble. "Certain issues cannot be concealed any longer." Poirot appeared at this point, undoubtedly summoned by the commotion, and I watched his sharp eyes take in every detail of the scene with characteristic thoroughness. The Major's anxiety, the tense grouping of the other inmates, and the atmosphere of barely contained hysteria that had begun to envelop our mountain jail were all captured in my friend's countenance as clearly as a snapshot. Sir Tenmolt Major. Poirot suggested retiring to Dr. Coe's study for a private conversation. The procession through the clinic's halls resembled a funeral march. Major Thornfield proceeded with the measured stride of a man nearing his own execution, while the others kept a respectable distance, their faces filled with morbid fascination and real pity. Poirot arranged the chairs in the study with his usual precision, positioning himself so that he could see both the Major's face and the window overlooking the crime scene. I took my usual seat, notebook in hand, though something about the Major's demeanor hinted that this interview would be unlike any others. Major Thornfield and Poirot began. "You wish to speak with me about Dr. Harrier's death." "I killed him," the Major stated bluntly, the words falling into the silence like stones into motionless water. God, assist me. I murdered Dr. Emil Coe, and I can no longer endure the weight of that knowing. When the confession finally arrived, it was delivered with military precision, which added to its terrible impact. Major Thornfield described in halting but painstaking detail his mounting wrath at Dr. C's treatment, his violent dreams of vengeance, and his disjointed memories of the fateful night. "I recall standing at the edge of the water," he added, his voice lowering to barely above a whisper. "The water was crystal clear and inviting, with Coe floating face down like a dead fish. But first he waited, his hands clenching and unclenching steadily. Before then, I recall the fight, his face submerged in the water, his eyes wide with dread and realization. The detail was convincing precisely because it was confusing." Major Thornfield detailed his military training, which included instruction on how to maintain sophisticated mechanical systems similar to the pool's safety devices. He described his intimate knowledge of the clinic's layout, which he had gained over months of nocturnal wanderings during his dissociative episodes. Most damningly, he pulled from his pocket a second brass key, an identical duplicate of the one discovered by Constable Weber. "I took this from Dr. K's office weeks ago," he explained, clutching the key with apparent disgust. "I told myself it was only curiosity, but I knew exactly what I was doing. The dreams had grown too vivid and relentless. I could no longer tell the difference between sleeping and awake, between memory and desire." His confession had a great emotional impact. Despite her personal enmity toward the deceased physician, Dr. Vance appeared moved by the Major's obvious suffering. The Countess dried her eyes with a lace handkerchief and murmured words of compassion in what I assumed to be Russian. Even Constable Weber, a man not known for expressing emotion, was visibly moved by the broken soldier's admission of guilt. Elena's reaction, however, struck me as the most remarkable. Rather than the relief one might have expected when discovering that the murderer had been discovered, she expressed what could only be characterized as tremendous anguish. Her face had gone pale as parchment, and she grabbed the back of her chair with such force that her knuckles appeared white against the dark wood. "Move, Emmy," she whispered, and I could see tears forming in her dark eyes. "What a dreadful load you've carried alone." The Major's description of the murder was both methodical and disturbing. He recalled his approach to the hydrotherapy wing. During one of his nocturnal episodes, his confrontation with Dr. Harrier, who appeared to be doing a late-night assessment of the facilities, and the resulting violent struggle. He fought, of course, Thornfield continued, his military training evident in the clinical precision with which he examined the physical aspects of the crime. But I had the advantage of surprise, and years of conditioning had made violence instinctive. For me, when it was ended and I saw him floating there, I realized I needed to hide what I had done. The narrative of the cover-up was equally compelling. The Major's engineering ability, along with his acquaintance with the pool's management, allowed him to construct the picture with astonishing precision. The careful replacement of the safety grate, the timing required to allow the thin sheet of ice to form, and the disposal of any evidence linking him to the crime, All demonstrated a level of planning that appeared inconsistent with the actions of a man experiencing a dissociative episode. But the dreams persisted, he explained, his voice breaking with anguish. Every night, I saw his face under the water. Every morning, I awoke to the taste of chlorine in my mouth. I couldn't undo what I had done. I couldn't find peace with the realization that I had become everything I had battled against. Constable Weber walked up with apparent reluctance, producing a pair of handcuffs for the air of a man performing a distasteful duty. Major Thornfield, I must arrest you for the murder of Dr. Emil Coe. The major submitted to the limitations with dignity, his military bearing unaffected by the situation. I understand, Constable. I have confessed to murder, and I must face the repercussions of my conduct. As the official processes were completed, I found myself staring at the faces of our assembled team. The case appeared to be closed with the killer discovered and confessing. However, something about the air indicated that not everyone shared my sense of resolution. Dr. Vance maintained her usual dubious demeanor, whilst the Countess appeared more worried with Elena's obvious anguish than the Major's destiny. Poirot's reaction, however, was the most telling. Throughout the Major's confession, my friend kept his usual stance of careful listening. However, I observed something in his demeanor that suggested skepticism rather than satisfaction. His gray eyes never left Elena's face during the most important parts of the evidence, and I noticed him taking note of every gesture and expression with the seriousness of a naturalist studying a rare and fascinating creature. As the others dispersed, discussing plans for the Major's incarceration until help arrived, Poirot took me aside with an expression I had come to know with his most serious concerns. "Mon ami," he whispered gently, making certain that we could not be overheard. "I fear we have just witnessed a display of extraordinary bravery and selflessness." "What do you mean?" I asked, but something in his tone suggested that I might not care to hear the answer. "I mean Hastings, Major Reginald Thornfield, has just confessed to a murder he did not commit, demonstrating the kind of honor that distinguishes such men as heroes and tragic figures." The implications of this sentence hit me like a physical blow. If Poirot was true, we had not solved the case, but rather observed its most complex aspect. A false confession delivered with such sincerity and supported by such persuasive evidence that even a trained investigator could be misled. As I stood in the twilight of the alpine evening, watching the snow continue to fall beyond the clinic's contemporary windows, I understood that our mountain mystery had reached its most perilous stage. A killer was skilled enough to go unnoticed while an innocent man bore the brunt of their crime, and I couldn't escape the notion that before this affair was finished, we'd uncover levels of deception that would call into question everything we thought we knew about the nature of guilt and innocence. Chapter 7. The Method. In the madness, the evening following Major Thornfield's dramatic revelation left me feeling uneasy. While the others seemed to accept that the riddle had been solved, I couldn't get rid of Poirot's cryptic comment about the Major's innocence. My companion had gone to Dr. Harry's study right after the arrest, and I had seen him through the glass door, crouched over the desk, with that intense concentration that I had grown to associate with his most challenging cases. When I finally joined him about midnight, the study had morphed into something akin to a detection laboratory. Documents were arranged in precise patterns on every available surface. Photographs of the crime scene were meticulously posted to the walls, and Satro stood at the heart of it all, his gray eyes moving carefully from one piece of evidence to the next. "Ah, mon ami," he murmured, not glancing up from the timeline he was creating. "Please take a seat. We have a lot to talk about, and I fear the truth is far more complicated than our gallant Major would have us believe." I sat in the familiar chair, noting how Poirot had organized his materials with the compulsive attention to detail that defined his approach. "You really feel Thornfield is innocent?" "I don't simply believe it, Hastings. I can illustrate it." "Poirot, tapped his fountain pen on a sheet of paper, filled in exact notations. Regarding these technical specifics of the pool's safety mechanism, my acquaintance subjected Major Thornfield's confession to the most rigorous investigation I had ever seen. With the methodical precision of a master clockmaker disassembling a timepiece, he found contradiction after contradiction in the seemingly convincing account we had heard. Poirot began by providing a thorough diagram of the safety system. The Major asserts that his military training qualified him to operate this equipment, but consider the specialized nature of these fasteners. They require not only technical knowledge, but also specific tools that are not available anywhere in this clinic save in the maintenance workshop, which is always locked and has Dr. Zimmer's key. He switched to a second chart. This one describes the sequence of events on the tragic night. Second, we have the issue of timing. According to Dr. Zimmer's medical records, Major Thornfield's reported incident occurred between 11:30 and 1:15 a.m. However, the posture of Dr. Harry's body, together with the water temperature readings, suggests that death occurred no earlier than 2:00 a.m. Investigation revealed more and more contradictions. The Major's physical condition, hampered by years of stress and recent medical procedures, would have rendered the prolonged physical effort required for the crime very impossible. Furthermore, his documented pattern of nightly wandering always took him to the clinic's higher floors, never to the basement-level hydrotherapy facilities. But probably most telling of all, Poirot said, pulling out a little bottle from his pocket. The vial appeared to contain a transparent liquid, and Poirot handled it with caution. In answer to my inquisitive gaze, he explained sodium pentothal, a potent sedative that, when taken in adequate dosages, leaves the victim unconscious while keeping normal vital signs. I found residues of this chemical in Dr. C's morning coffee cup, which had been properly cleaned, but not sufficiently enough to eliminate all evidence. The consequences of this revelation were astounding. Do you mean Dr. Harry was drugged before his murder? Someone with access to pharmacological drugs and the knowledge to securely administer them knocked Dr. Harry comatose before transporting him to the pool and staging his death by drowning. Poirot's eyes shone with joy. This was not a crime of passion perpetrated during a nighttime episode. This was a carefully planned execution carried out by someone who was intimately familiar with both the victim's habits and the clinic's operations. As daylight neared, Poirot's investigation became increasingly focused. His focus shifted from the obvious suspects, those with clear reasons and obvious possibilities, to the one person whose very anonymity made her the ideal choice for such a complex crime. Elena Vasquez, he reflected, reviewing a personnel dossier that Dr. Zimmer had reluctantly provided. Isn't this her most interesting background? Trained in Barcelona as a psychiatric nurse with further accreditation in hydrotherapy techniques. 5 years' experience in institutional settings before her work with the Countess. I struggled to accept this line of thinking. But Poirot has been nothing but helpful during this crisis, and her loyalty to the Countess is clear in every move. Ah, but that is exactly what makes her dangerous, Poirot answered. Consider her place in this household. She is implicitly trusted, has access to every aspect of the clinic, and is intimately familiar with each resident's medical condition and daily routine. She is, as you mentioned, invisible. The ideal servant who goes through our lives without ever raising suspicions. When Poirot began gathering evidence against Elena, it became both compelling and alarming. Her medical training had included substantial experience with the specific type of hydrotherapy equipment placed in the clinic. Her access to the Countess' drugs supplied a ready supply of the sedatives used to incapacitate Dr. Herrier. Most importantly, her presence at the clinic predated the Countess' arrival by several months, which had escaped everyone's notice until now. But what may be her motive? I argued, still unable to believe that the quiet, professional nurse was capable of such deliberate murder. Pooh responded with a bundle of documents he found stashed in Elena's private quarters. A search was carried out with Constable Weber's hesitant participation while the nurse attended to the Countess' morning ritual. The letters, written in Spanish and stretching back more than 5 years, depicted an intense relationship between Elena and a young medical researcher, known simply as E. The correspondent described shared goals, collaborative research projects, and hopes for a future together that had been dashed by the man's growing fixation with his work and rising mental instability. Monderai breathed as the reality began to dawn. Elena and Dr. Harry were lovers. Hastings is more than just a lover. They were true collaborators, intellectual equals with a common vision of revolutionary mental care. Poirot highlighted a specific letter with grim satisfaction. But take note of the date of this final email. Elena describes her decision to leave and her unwillingness to watch the man she loved ruin himself through paranoia and megalomania. The image that emerged was terrible and horrifying. Elena used her position as the Countess' companion to study Dr. Coe's declining health. The wife who had previously shared his aspirations and objectives had now witnessed his change into the authoritarian character we had met. A guy whose brilliant mind had been corrupted by power and solitude into something hideous. She returned to save him. Poirot's voice continued to be thick with the weight of the revelation. But when she realized what he had become and the pain he was inflicting on his patients, she made a different decision entirely. The third piece of evidence was Elena's journal, which she kept during her time at the clinic, chronicling her growing revulsion at Dr. C's tactics and her eventual judgment that he constituted a threat that could no longer be tolerated. The final entry, dated the night before the murder, was very frightening. Tomorrow, I'll do what love and mercy demand. Emile cannot be allowed to continue destroying innocent brains. The man I once loved died a long time ago. What remains is only a shadow that causes pain to all who see it. I will stop his pain and prevent him from inflicting additional evil upon others. As I sat in the early light of the alpine morning, surrounded by proof of Elena's intricate deception, I was confronted with a fact that called into question all I thought I knew about the nature of guilt and innocence. Here was a woman who committed murder out of a perverted sense of pity and love, rather than anger or greed. A killer whose motives were as complex as they were ultimately unfathomable. Poirot gathered the documents with remarkable care, his face wearing the weight of a man who had unearthed truths that should have remained hidden. The case was solved, and the genuine killer was identified. But I could see from his demeanor that this victory did not make him happy. The game was almost complete, but the most perilous step, confronting a killer who believed herself to be an angel of mercy, remained ahead of us. As the clinic came to life around us and the other residents went about their morning routines, I couldn't shake the sensation that we were nearing a climax that would put not only our detective skills to the test, but also our understanding of the nature of justice itself. Chapter 8. The Mercy of the Devoted. The afternoon of the 5th day brought a subtle change in the mountain weather. A warming of the air that suggested the iron grip of winter was finally loosening on our remote alpine prison. However, within the walls of the Clinique Lac Noir, the atmosphere remained as tense and foreboding as ever, weighed down by the awareness that, while one mystery appeared to have been solved, deeper truths remained concealed beyond the surface of appearance. Poirot had requested that all inhabitants assemble in the main salon at 4 p.m., and I noticed a reluctant response to this summons. Major Thornfield, who was formally under arrest, was allowed to attend under Constable Weber's close supervision. Despite the handcuffs, his military bearing remained intact, and something about his demeanor suggested a man who had found a peculiar peace in his confession. Regardless of the long-term implications, the salon itself was a modern design masterpiece, with large windows that provided a panoramic view of the snow-covered peaks that encircled us. Under normal circumstances, the space would have exuded a sense of peaceful opulence. This afternoon, however, it had been turned into something resembling a trial, with chairs set in a precise semicircle facing the magnificent fireplace, where Poirot had positioned himself with his trademark theatrical flair. "Madame Sher," he continued, his gray eyes scanning the assembled faces. "The death of Dr. Ramil Coe has placed a darkness over this establishment, and it's time to dispel that shadow with the light of truth." Elena sat next the Countess with her usual calm demeanor, hands folded in her lap and dark eyes locked on her face. However, I observed a little strain in her posture that had not been during our previous interviews, and her habit of smoothing her starched uniform had become more prominent. "Major Thornfield," Poirot said, turning to the arrested guy with apparent sympathy, "your confession yesterday showed great courage and selflessness. However, I must advise you and everyone present that you are completely innocent of Dr. C's murder." This announcement had an electrifying effect. Dr. Vance sat forward in her chair, paying close attention as the Countess gasped audibly and clasped her handkerchief to her lips. Most surprising of all was Elena's reaction, a barely perceptible tightening around her eyes that indicated she was bracing herself for the impending disclosure. The evidence against Major Thornfield, as Poirot explains with systematic clarity, looks compelling only after diligent investigation. The technical knowledge required, the timing of the crime, and the physical abilities required all point away from our valiant Major and toward someone else entirely. For the following quarter hour, my acquaintance dismantled the evidence against Major Thornfield with the same thoroughness that had made him famous throughout Europe. He established the absurdity of the Major's timeline, the inconsistency of his alleged procedures, and most damningly, the presence of sedatives in Dr. Harry's system, which could only have been provided by someone with medical skill and pharmacological knowledge. No, Poirot decided this was not a crime of passion committed during a nighttime period. This was a meticulously planned execution carried out by someone who was intimately familiar with the victim's routines and the clinic's operations. His focus shifted to Elena, and I watched as her calm demeanor began to crumble beneath the weight of his searching gaze. "Mademoiselle Elena Vasquez," he replied quietly. "Or should I say Dr. Elena Vasquez, because you are a qualified physician, aren't you?" Despite your current position as a nurse and companion, Elena's reaction was barely audible. "Yes, and you were Dr. Emil Coe's research partner and intimate companion several years ago while he was undertaking his groundbreaking trauma therapy study in Barcelona." "Yes." The confession that followed was given with respect, which made it much more painful. Elena discussed her relationship with Dr. C, their shared love for healing, their collaborative study into the treatment of psychological trauma, and their hopes for a future dedicated to alleviating human suffering. "But Emile began to change," she explained, her voice becoming more powerful as she spoke. "The recognition and success turned him from a healer to something quite else. He grew fascinated with power and control over his patients' thoughts. When I resisted his more aggressive approaches, he abruptly terminated both our collaboration and our personal connection." Poirot nodded with apparent sympathy. "So you returned as the Countess's companion to see what he had become?" "I hoped to discover that my suspicions were unwarranted, and that the man I had loved remained beneath the reputation he had established." Elena's serenity eventually shattered, and tears streamed down her pale cheeks. "Instead, I found something considerably worse than I had expected. He was gradually killing the minds he claimed to repair, transforming therapy into torment and patients into victims of his megalomania. The method by which he committed the murder was revealed with clinical precision, including the carefully administered sedative in Dr. C's evening coffee, the transport of his unconscious body to the hydrotherapy pool, and the professional staging of the drowning scene, which left no trace of violence. Most chillingly, she manipulated Major Thornfield's confession, planting subtle suggestions during his weak times, and providing compelling facts that only the genuine killer could have known. "You allowed an innocent man to confess to your crime," Dr. Vance noted, visibly disgusted. "I manipulated his existing guilt and confusion." "Yes," Elena admitted, without trying to excuse her behavior. "But I believed and hoped that his military record and clear mental state would garner him sympathy and eventually exoneration. I never intended for him to suffer because of my decision." The Countess, who had stayed mute during the revelation, now spoke in a voice full of betrayal and sadness. "Elena, how could you deceive me so thoroughly? I trusted you with my life, my secrets, and my very soul, Madame, and I protected you as faithfully as I could," Elena said quietly. "My deception regarding my true purpose here in no way diminished my genuine care for your welfare." As the confession came to an end, Elena's voice took on an almost calm sound that I found very frightening. She described her choice to kill Dr. Call as an act of mercy, not just for his potential victims, but also for the man himself, whose bright mind had become his own prison. "I could not bear to watch him continue his descent into madness," she explained, her eyes distant with memories. The Emil the first adored was already gone, consumed by his own ambition and insecurity. What remained was essentially a shell that produced pain wherever it traveled. I emancipated him from that existence, just as I rescued his patients from his anguish. The sound of engines approaching from the valley below broke up this sad image. And from the salon's large windows, we could see the first rescue vehicles making their way up the newly cleared mountain route. That our solitude was finally over. But the outcome was far from the relief I had hoped for. Constable Weber carried out his duties with obvious reluctance, moving the handcuffs from Major Thornfield to Ella Lenena with the remorseful tone of a man obliged to arrest someone he had grown to appreciate. She submitted to the shackles with the same quiet dignity she had displayed throughout her confession, offering no protest or attempt at justification. As the rescue team entered the clinic and began evacuating its residents, I found myself standing beside Poirot at one of the large windows, watching the sun set behind the alpine peaks in a display of natural beauty that seemed almost mockingly peaceful given the human tragedy we had witnessed. "A most complex affair," my companion whispered, his breath misting the glass. "Love turned into devastation, tenderness became murder, and healing into hurt. In such circumstances, it is difficult to believe that true justice can exist." The caravan that left the Clinique Lac Noir that evening brought survivors of a catastrophe that would be debated and dissected for years. Major Thornfield, exonerated but eternally changed by his false confession, rode silently with the bearing of a man who had seen the full depths of human complexity. Dr. Vance and the Countess sat apart, each immersed in private thoughts about how thoroughly they had been duped by someone they had implicitly trusted. Elena Vasquez rode toward an uncertain fate in the police van that followed our parade with the poise of a lady who had acted in accordance with her own moral code, regardless of the repercussions. As I watched the clinic fade behind us into the growing mountain darkness, I mused on the fine line that separates love from obsession, mercy from murder, and justice from vengeance. In the rarefied air of the Swiss Alps, we had discovered puzzles that went far beyond the mechanics of crime, touching on fundamental concerns about human nature and the often horrific choices that love may impose. Thank you for joining us at Lac Noir. If you enjoyed this mystery about Poirot and the dark secrets of love, mercy, and the narrow border between healing and harm, be sure to subscribe for more mysteries like this.